Chapter 16. The Wonderful Tale of Alibaba and the 40 Bandits. "Why is it," said Scheherazade on the 512th night, "that Allah sometimes deals such different fates to two brothers of the same parents?" "My brother Shahzaman and I have experienced exactly the same fate at the hands of women," her husband complained. "Yes, my proud and haughty husband, the difference between you is only one of height. But just as you stand to the shoulder of a giraffe, and your brother stands only to the shoulder of a horse, so it was with the fortunes of Ali Baba and his brother Kasim. Kasim became as rich as trees are rich in leaves, but Ali Baba could only scratch a living as a woodcutter. By great hard work, and by his wife's thriftiness, he came by 2 donkeys which he took into the forest daily to carry back the firewood. While he was out with the donkeys one day in a rocky wooded valley, he saw a great cloud of dust ahead of him on the forest track. Because it was a wild, lonely, and out-of-the-way place, Ali Baba hid himself, shooing the donkeys into the forest and climbing a leafy tree to hang like a squirrel in its branches. It proved a wise precaution. The cloud of dust rose from the hooves of 40 horses ridden by 40 dervish bandits. Their hearts were as black as their beards, their clothes as black as their deeds, and their souls as black as their horses. Their leader was dressed in black astrakhan and rode a horse whose mane, like his, stood up in wild disarray. He halted his corps of bandits almost below Ali Baba's hiding place, beside this valley wall, a sheer cliff which rose from ground to sky, all gray but for a few scrubby bushes. "Open sesame!" he cried. I tell no lies, but believe it if you can. In answer to his words, the cliff face opened its mouth. It yawned. It gaped. Where there had been solid rock, there was suddenly a black cave, and the bandit chief walked boldly in, carrying his saddlebag across one arm. His 40 men followed, each with bulging saddlebags, which were empty when the band reappeared. "They're hiding their plunder," thought Ali Baba, "or I am no true believer." As his men remounted, the bandit chief faced the cave's entrance and pronounced the words, "Close, sesame!" No sooner had the final E touched the air than the cliff wall had closed, like the sea closes over a rock pool, leaving no sign that a cave had ever existed. The sound of hooves and the flying dust settled to a stillness, and Ali Baba climbed down. He stood well back from the wall of rock, coughed nervously, and addressed it. "Open sesame, please," he said, and in less time than it takes a fly to blink, a cave appeared in the cliff wall. "May Allah cross the threshold with me," whispered Ali Baba, and went inside, down a flight of stairs carved from solid rock and into a sunless cavern. The door closed behind him. The bandits had left a single torch to burn itself out in a bracket on the wall. By its light, Ali Baba saw the spoils of 100 years of thieving, the contents of 100,000 saddlebags, the booty of 3 generations of bandits. Sacks of gold had outgrown their clothes and burst through holes onto the floor. The lids of chests had been lifted off and turned upside down to hold more golden goblets, necklaces, bracelets, and plates after the chests had overflowed. Barrels of rubies were spilling their brilliant color like wine across the floor. Gold coins were as plentiful as the drops in a waterfall. Like a man who dreams quickly for fear of waking up, Ali Baba dragged 2 sacks of gold up the steps. "If I am not too low in the esteem of Allah, may the magic words release me from this amazing place. Open sesame!" Ali Baba found himself on the forest path, and he was able to fetch treasure enough to load both donkeys until they were bow-legged with gold. Then he closed the cave behind him with the magic words. He let night go before him on the road so that he could creep home in its shadow and deliver to his wife and son the wealth he had always dreamed of earning for them. His wife turned the gold coins over like water in a bowl, cutting into them with her hands time and time again to let them trickle through her fingers. When she set about counting it, however, Ali Baba laughed and said, "There is more gold there than can be counted on an abacus. What more do you want to know?" "We must measure it some way," his wife insisted. "We must know how much more than nothing we own." "It is enough to keep us in bread all our lives and to pay for a servant girl to help you in the house. Knowing that much, be content." They promised each other in the sight of Allah that they would tell no one about the gold or where it came from. for the bandits' eyes were undoubtedly sharper than their swords, and their ears sharper still. Any revenge they took would be more terrible than fire's revenge on straw. But Ali Baba's wife could not bear to be rich without knowing the extent of her wealth, and ran to her brother-in-law's house to borrow a measuring jug. Kasim's wife had a great kitchen, and her winter's store of grain was heaped like sand dunes outside her larder, so of course she owned a large brass measuring jug. She had an even greater store of curiosity, seeing her sister-in-law's great excitement, and knowing that Ali Baba's earnings could buy woefully little grain, she ached to uncover the mystery. Out of everyone's sight, she smeared a dab of butter in the base of the measuring jug and gave it to Ali Baba's wife, who ran home and measured the weight by which her happiness had increased since morning. Kasim's wife, of course, called to collect the measuring jug, and there in the base was a gold coin sticking to the butter. She showed it to her husband, who was ferociously jealous, as only a brother can be when he has always thought himself the best and most successful in a family. "What wealth have you come into, Baba?" Kasim said, laying a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Out with it now. Brothers should keep no secrets from one another. Allah tells us to share our good fortune liberally." There was nothing Ali Baba could do but tell his story to Kasim, who decided, as his brother spoke the last full stop, to have every penny of the remaining treasure himself. He found his way to the cave following Ali Baba when he went to fetch another sack of gold and silver coins. Waiting his chance, Kasim approached the valley wall, coughed respectfully, and said, "Open sesame." In the time that it takes light to shine, the treasure of the dervish bandits was laid out in front of him. He walked among the sacks and barrels and chests and bags, wondering which to take home first. Then, dragging 2 sacks up the stone staircase, he backed into the cave door. "Open wheat," he said irritably, but nothing happened. "Oh, sorry. Open barley," he said, certain that he had chosen the correct cereal. But nothing happened. The commonest words are the most difficult to remember. He recited all the crops he could think of, but the magic words, "Open sesame," were as lost in his memory as a pin dropped into the sea. Kasim was still stamping up and down the staircase when the bandit leader and his 40 men came to the cave with more treasure. "Open sesame," said the robber chief, and in less time than it takes a bee's wings to beat, he stood face to face with Kasim. Allah chooses the fate of all men, or Kasim would have chosen differently. The bandits cut him into slices on the spot, a thing that no believer should do to another, for a man likes to be buried in one piece, does he not? Thinking that their secret was safe with Kasim, who could tell it to no one now, they left the cave and went about their murderous business. Ali Baba went with his donkeys to fetch more gold, and brought back instead the parts and pieces of his brother. As he had promised his wife, Ali Baba had hired a girl to help in the house. Allah guided his choice, for the girl, Maranha, was an exceptionally bright, sensible, and loyal servant. Ali Baba's 20-year-old son was quick to notice her pretty face and ready smile. "Maranha," said Ali Baba that night, I find I must ask your help in a rather unpleasant matter. I hope I won't regret starting work here under my roof when you hear what it is." "I hope you won't regret starting work here under my roof when you hear what it is." "Master," said Maranha, "I have neither mother nor father, and you have made a place for me under your roof and found me food when my stomach was empty. Ask anything." So he took Maranha out to where the donkeys were standing by the back door, and explaining the circumstances, showed her his brother's parts and pieces, and asked if something could be done to give him a secret but honorable burial. "Of course, sir," she said, and lifted the sacks down from the donkey. "I shall carry your brother down to the cellar and find a tailor who can smarten him up for his funeral." "It must remain secret, Maranha, or the robber chief will find out that I, too, know the secret of the magic cave. Now, I must tell his wife and have her come here to share the shelter of my humble roof and my family's food." Maranha went to town, found a tailor poor enough to sew iron to stone if he were asked, and led him, blindfolded, to Ali Baba's house, where he sewed all night in the cellar. In the morning, Kasim's body was a fine imitation of the living man. All his parts and pieces were joined up again, and he made a respectable corpse for his relatives to follow weeping to the grave. No one would have known that Kasim was the man at the cave. Ali Baba decided that further trips there were out of the question. The strength of Kasim's greed and the weakness of his memory had separated Ali Baba from the dervish's great fortune, but he was content with his small good fortune and would have continued praising Allah undisturbed if fate had not also favored the robber chief. Returning to the cave, the bandits instantly knew that their secret had not died with Kasim. Someone had collected up the parts and pieces of his body from inside the cave. Somebody else knew the secret words, "Open Sesame." The bandit leader asked in town if anyone had been buried secretly or in several pieces. No one had. If he had not torn his trousers in the late evening outside the tailor's shop, there would have been no more story to tell. "Do you sew without use of your eyes, that you can work so late at night by the light of a single candle?" said the robber chief as he waited for his trousers to be patched. "Truly, sir, if Allah were to strike me blind," replied the tailor, "I could probably continue my profession. Didn't I sew together a man's body only last week in a dark cellar with no more candles than this?" A painted signpost could not have directed the robber chief more surely towards the man he had sworn to kill. He paid the tailor 2 golden coins, blindfolded him, and had the old man feel his way along the route Maranha had taken him. He led the dervish to the very door of Ali Baba's house, and the bandit, whose heart was as empty as the moon is empty of heat, drew a cross on the doorpost. The next day his men could burn the marked house to the ground, and in the mouths of any who knew the secret of the magic cave. "Why have you stopped, Scheherazade?" said King Shahryar. "I hope that is not the end of the story, for I hate stories that leave villains unpunished." "It is not the end, judge of all living judges," his wife replied, "but I have foolishly left too little time to finish the wonderful story of Ali Baba and the 40 bandits before morning comes and occupies your ears with matters of state. I fear that my head will remember little of the story after it has left my shoulders, but I know better than to ask you to spare my miserable life another day." "You have some of the wisdom of your father, Scheherazade, for I would not grant you your life if you asked for it. However, your head cannot be spared until the wonderful story of Ali Baba is finished. See that you complete the story between the setting of today's sun and the rising of tomorrow's morning star." "To hear you is to obey," said Scheherazade, and pressing her fingertips together, bowed low to the king as grass bows before the wind. Chapter 17. Ali Baba, the Robber Chief's Revenge. "Are you like those rascally old storytellers who forget the beginning of their story before they have reached its end?" said Shahryar accusingly. "Are you going to tell me that the robber chief had marked the wrong door with chalk, or that the 40 thieves all suddenly became good believers and gave up their life of crime?" "No, indeed, my critical lord, for who am I to change the story from the way it is written? The chalk cross did mark out Ali Baba's house, and the 40 thieves were quite intent on killing him and all his household by the first light of day. But Maranha, the maidservant who rose before the sun, saw the cross when she went to sweep the step. Thinking that some gypsies had marked the house in order to curse it or rob it, she took a piece of chalk herself and drew a cross on every other doorpost in the street. When the dervish arrived with his 40 armed men, they found a string of houses that looked as alike as the leaves of a single branch. "It seems that I must spend another 2 gold coins at the tailor's shop," said the robber chief, chewing his beard in rage, "before I can blunt my sword on that thief's neckbone." And of course it did not take him long, with the help of the tailor, to single out Ali Baba's house once again. This time he formed a plan that would make killing the whole family as easy as crushing strawberries with his tongue. He dressed himself as a merchant selling cooking oil and brought 20 donkeys and 40 large stone jars. Each bandit was commanded to bore a breathing hole in the lid of a jar, then climb inside with as many knives and daggers as could comfortably keep him company in that confined space. "When the time is right," said the chief dervish, "I shall lift off the lids and you will leap out, killing everyone who has not been dead for at least a year. Is that clear?" "To hear you is to obey," said his men, and climbed into 39 of the jar. The 40th was filled with olive oil. "Brother woodcutter," said the oil merchant to Ali Baba as their donkeys met in the street outside the little house, "Allah is generous in offering me a starry night to cover my head tonight, but I fear my donkeys will be thirsty by tomorrow morning, since I have neither food nor drink for myself or my animals. Won't you allow a humble oil merchant to buy water with this vat of purest olive oil?" and he showed the contents of the one oil-filled jar. Without a suspicion in his simple head, therefore, Ali begged the merchant to keep his oil and spend the night under his roof and enjoy what humble hospitality a woodcutter could afford. "First Kasim's wife, and now the oil merchant," said Maranha. "Soon there will be as many people sitting around my master's table as sit round that dervish campfire shaming Allah with their unholy ways. Allah Akbar! I've run out of oil." With 40 tubs of cooking oil in the yard, Maranha felt that their guest could spare them a measure of oil, so she went outside with a cup in her hand and waited until her eyes became accustomed to the dark. Just as she went to unseal the lid of a jar, a voice inside it said, "Is it time?" Maranha clapped her hand over her mouth and danced about on one foot until her heart slipped back down her throat and settled among her ribs. A silly, superstitious girl would have thought the jar contained an ifrit or a jinni, but Maranha was an exceptionally bright and sensible servant. Her heart spoke with her brain, and together they arrived at understanding. Brushing against a dozen more jars, Maranha heard men's voices say, "Is it time?" And she whispered in as deep a voice as possible, "Not yet." Then she fetched a large cream cheese from the kitchen and stopped up the breathing holes in all the 39 jars which spoke. The meal ended. The family went to bed. The robber chief crept out to the yard and unsealed the jars, whispering, "It's time now." But no one answered. What murderer can complain to his victim that his plans have all been spoiled? The next morning, to Ali Baba's amazement, his guest looked at him as though he would bite if he had teeth enough to do so. Then he led his donkeys away down the street without a word of thanks or farewell, and went to the magic cave to mope about and plot revenge. When Maranha told Ali Baba what had happened, he praised Allah for guiding him to such a bright, sensible, and loyal serving girl, and said, "After such a deed, the walls of my house are looking at you differently. In the house of a man with one son, there is room for a daughter. From today, you are my adopted daughter and not my serving girl." So Allah provides for his most humble servant. It is said that the snake with nothing to strangle will strangle itself. The robber chief had no need to murder Ali Baba, for now the woodcutter put all thought of the magic cave out of his mind and lived in comfortable poverty, eking out the gold from his 3 visits there. But the leader of the 40 bandits, now the leader of none, lived for the day when he could shave Ali Baba's beard with a dagger and part his hair with an axe. He disguised himself as a wealthy sheik and returned to town a year later riding a camel. He encouraged the beast to fall down outside the front door of Ali Baba's modest house, spilling his rider and baggage into the road. The woodcutter was, of course, the first to help him up and offer him hospitality according to the laws of Allah and his Prophet. That evening Maranha surpassed her usual skill and served a meal which delighted the tongue without weighing heavy on the stomach. When the bandit consulted his stomach, he considered that to murder the cook might be wasteful, so he offered Ali Baba a fair price for his maidservant. "I regret to say that Maranha is no longer mine to sell as a maidservant," said Ali with pride, "for I adopted her as my own daughter." "Then perhaps I should ask her for a wife," said the sheik. Maranha, who was serving coffee to the assembled company, looked quickly but closely at the sheik in case she should indeed find herself given away to him before the day was finished. For what gracious host can refuse the request of a guest under his roof, especially a wealthy sheik? "I and my household are all your property, noble sheik," said Ali Baba, "for so it must be between host and guest." "And would you like to be married to me, my pretty little gazelle?" said the bandit, catching hold of her hand. Maranha brushed herself against the sheik and ran her fingers through her hair, shocking her father and outraging Ali Baba's son, who until then had looked with pleasure at his new sister. "Shall I dance for you before you decide?" she asked the sheik in a voice as thick and sweet as syrup. She ran from the room and changed into dancing clothes, a white muslin veil and crimson robe, and she carried for her dance a pair of tiny cymbals on the finger and thumb of her left hand and a curved ivory dagger in her right hand. Round and round she whirled, to the rhythm of her bare feet slapping on the floor, and to the music of her cymbals, and some music within her dark foreign soul. Though she turned this way and that, and her plaited hair cracked like whipcord, her eyes never seemed to leave the wealthy sheik, who was spellbound by her weaving dance. Faster and faster she turned in the middle of the room until her plaits were flying out as level as a black horizon. Closer and closer to the floor she whirled, and the white ivory blade of the knife made a white whirling circle around her blurred crimson shape. The sheik rose to his knees, and his eyes glittered with excitement, his right hand beating the floor in rhythm with her feet. He put his hand into his robe to pull a purse of money, as Maranha added a chant to her dancing. "And isn't that how? And isn't that how? And isn't that how the dervish dances?" she shrieked, and dropped on the sheik, plunging the knife into his heart. "What have you done, you wild, peculiar woman?" cried Ali Baba's wife. But Maranha was too out of breath to speak. "What have you done, daughter?" asked Ali Baba, heartbroken with shame. "Knife! Knife!" she panted. "Had a knife." "You foolish, wicked girl," said her adoptive brother. "He was reaching for a purse of money to give you." He turned over the body of the sheik to show her her mistake, and a purse of money dropped from his right hand, and a long silver serrated dagger from his left. "I saw it in the folds of his robe as I served him coffee," said Maranha, "and recognized the face of your old enemy, the dervish robber chief." Then Maranha removed the bandit's disguise and withdrew to her bedroom to change into the modest clothes of a modest believer. Ali Baba was so delighted with the bravery and resourcefulness of little Maranha that he married her to his son to make her truly a part of his family. And after a year or so, the woodcutter asked his courage if it was strong enough to make a journey to the magic cave. He found the cliff face overgrown with weeds and mosses, and the forest path empty of footprints. But 1,000 years cannot dull the memory of Allah's magic places, and when Ali Baba spoke the words, "Open, Sesame!" in less time than it takes the heart to love, the cave entrance opened, and the dervish treasure of 3 generations lay at his feet. Ali Baba became the richest man in the whole province, and built a palace for himself and his wife on the hill in town. He also bought a little farm for his son and Maranha, and although the young man earned an income no larger or smaller than the average sheik, he took it into his head and said aloud on many occasions that he was the richest man in the whole world.